Hey, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I hope I'm not forcing you to get settled here. It's cold.
It is.
And it's cold.
Windy too.
Windy and cold. Yeah. And it's not easy to get out of a nice warm living room and away from the TV and all the ball games on down here. So I appreciate it. Anyway, I'm Dick Bennett, author of the Rock Creek Trilogy, which is Rock Creek, Crooked River, and Bill Judy, which is my most recent book right here. I want to thank some very special people for putting this on, and I hope I don't butcher their names. But right over here is Edurne Erstegi. How's that? And where's this Annie here?
Yep.
Annie's there.
Annie Gavika and Teresa Franzoya.
Yep.
Franzoya. Where's Teresa?
She's in the other room.
Okay, so they put this together, and I really appreciate it. And if you haven't already, look around this place. It's really cool. This is a really cool museum, particularly the camp wagon. We call it a camp wagon. They call it a sheep wagon. I don't know how that ever happened.
Not a couple, not a couple.
Yep.
So I think what they've done here is a great tribute to the Basque culture and the contributions that the Basque people made to Idaho and the city of Boise and really the whole Intermountain West. The culture has just made all of us more. It's a rich experience for all of us to have the Basque culture here. And I would suggest that you come back sometime when you have time and go through the Cyrus Jacobs Lubaraga house, which is right next door. It's been restored. It was a Basque boarding house in the early 1900s. And the Basque sheepherders used to come in the wintertime when they weren't working and stay in the boarding house. And it's been restored with all the furniture and furnishings that you would expect to have in the early 1900s. But it was comfortable for them because there were people that spoke the same language, and the food was familiar to the food they grew up with in Spain. So it was a very lively place, and it was kind of the center of the Basque activity here in Boise. Many of you, I'm sure, have not had a chance to read Bill Judy. Maybe that's why you're here. So I'll refrain from going too deeply into the story itself. But I'll try to say briefly that it's a story of a poor Southern boy who fought in the Confederate Army and the story of an escaped slave. They have an unlikely encounter in Eastern Tennessee at the end of the Civil War and join forces to pursue the ex-slave's dream. I'm going to read you a short prologue from the book that's part of the book here. And I wrote it to give the reader some perspective on time and place, so that the reader would understand where this was all coming from. So if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to read this short prologue. Bill Judy was a soldier and a miner and a freighter and a friend. In 3 of these, he gave it his all. Mining, however, did not suit him. He fought for the South in the American Civil War, but did not fight to preserve the slave-holding aristocracy, nor did he fight in a righteous revolution to form a new nation. That's important. That's not what he fought for. He fought to remove invaders from his homeland. He fought because his companions fought and needed his support. And he fought because there was no future on his father's farm. Bill Judy grew up in the mountains of northern Georgia, one of the poorest regions of the South, where slavery never got a grip. He knew there were slaves in the lowlands of Georgia and Carolinas, just like he knew there were fish in the ocean. He thought neither had anything to do with him. Learned that one did. Bill Judy was a low white cannon fodder from the aristocratic South. He was one of the millions throughout history, be they Russians, Turks, Romans, or Hessians, or those from other domains, who were the disposables of the entire little world and the fuel that fired the boilers of the elite. What he was fighting for, although it never birth, the power, and the privilege of the fortunate. Soon after the war, he would gain a unlikely friend, a friend who would open his eyes to the underbelly of a culture he never knew existed, a culture of abject oppression. Bill Judy would never be the same. So that's the intro to the book. But I'm gonna try to describe to you the situation that they found themselves in 1865. In 1865, the bloodiest conflict ever fought in the Western Hemisphere was over, leaving 700,000 Americans dead, victims of battles throughout the South and northward into the free states of Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. The South had lost and was literally laid waste, its economy in ruins, and its people barely able to feed themselves. In the last year of the war, as the outcome became more and more apparent, the Union Army made a brutal, unspoken statement to their Southern brethren: never even think about doing this again. The sin of slavery is over in America. Get used to it. In the South, slavery had been a way of life since the first slave ship arrived in the New World in 1619. That's 246 years before Bill, Judy, and Samuel even met. Over all those years, slavery had become deeply embedded in the culture of the South, and its value to the South was enormous. Here are some realities that might help you grasp how dependent the South was on the peculiar institution, is what they called it in the North. The average value of a slave in 1860 was about $800, of course, depending on gender, age, health, and so on. So in today's dollar, a slave would be worth about $26,400. And some of the larger plantations owned well over 100 slaves. According to the 1860 census, there were about 9.5 million people in what would make up the Confederacy in 1861. Of this total, more than 4 million were in bondage, leaving about 5.5 million free people. So there were almost as many people in bondage in the South at the time as there were people who were free. The monetary value placed on human lives in bondage in 1860 amounted to about 80% of the South's total wealth. To put that in perspective, today the total value of our information technology industry amounts to about 8% of America's wealth. So they had 80% of their wealth tied up in slaves, and we only have 8% of our wealth tied up in technology. If you're a slaveholder, what would happen to you and your economy in the South, if all your slaves were set free? Not only would you lose your slaves, your biggest single investment, but now from your perspective, you had no way to economically grow and harvest your main crops, cotton and tobacco. Most in the North thought slavery was a moral abomination, a disgrace and a blight on humanity, an affront to God, and it had to end. After 246 years of rationalization and trying to justify its existence, Southern slaveholders had come to believe that owning other human beings was their right. It had always been their right, and it was going to continue to be their right at all costs. War was the only answer. Only 8% of Southern households owned slaves. So 92% of the households did not, and most of those households were in poorer areas where tobacco and cotton wouldn't grow. That was where our character, Bill Judy, came from. He never met or even encountered a slave. Samuel Moore, on the other hand, our other character in the story, had a much different background. When he was of age, about 12, he was sold to a slave broker who hauled him bound in chains to a slave auction in Knoxville, Tennessee, where he was bought by a moonshiner. The moonshiner abused Samuel terribly, made him work his whiskey still, and chained him to a tree at night so he wouldn't escape. So there you have it, two very unlikely young men, both in their teens, They meet along a river and realize they have more in common than they may have originally thought. They travel together despite intense discrimination and violence, and they become very good friends and make a plan for their. All three of the books in the trilogy are available here for purchase. And so I would be honored to sign any of the books you purchase or the books you happen to bring. And you can learn more about all three of the books, Crooked River, Rock Creek, and Bill Judy, on my website, rwbennettauthor.com. I also have a new short story, I guess you call it. It's not really a book, it's a short story that I'm offering. It's on Amazon right now for $2.99, and it's about a 2-hour read, and I'm offering it for free starting tomorrow.
On Amazon?
On Amazon. But just for you guys all coming, you can get it for free with this barcode. This is a wait till tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a contemporary story. It's about a rancher and his 2 daughters and his wife. This rancher is a very abusive guy, and it's in a fictional place in the mid-1980s, so it's contemporary. It's kind of a fun story, and it kind of reminds me of my own background in the ranching industry. And so I hope you enjoy it. It's only about a 2-hour read. So what I'd like to do is, if there are any questions about Bill Judy or Rock Creek or Crooked River or the Civil War or anything you want to ask about, I'd love to. Yeah.
So my curiosity is, as an author, you have to create these characters. So how did you create the character of Bill Judy and Sammy? I mean, what led you to invent them in your mind?
Well, Bill Judy was a character in the first book, Rock Creek.
Right. Yeah.
And he was
But that was later
a
in
very
his life.
short-lived character, much to my wife's chagrin over there. She read it the first time and she said, "I can't believe you killed Bill Judy."
I can't either. I didn't like that.
So anyway, he was a very strong character in the book. As Rock Creek progressed, as I wrote it, I just couldn't find a place for him in the rest of the book because he's too strong a character, and I had to have my other characters kind of take the lead in the story. So I made up my mind that when the time was right, I would write a story about him, and it would be a prequel to Rock Creek. So yeah, I was fortunate enough just recently, about a month ago, I had lunch with Anthony Dorr. You know who Anthony Dorr is? All the Light You Cannot See in the new book, Cuckoo Land. And so we were talking about the characters. He's got a lot of characters in his new book, and we were talking about characters and building characters. And he remembered a quote that I used for Mark Twain. Mark Twain was asked, "How do you come up with these characters?" And he said, "I don't come up with them. They're people that I encountered my entire life, or an amalgam of those people that I've encountered in all my life." And so anyway, yeah, did I answer your question?
You sort of did, yes. But you had to learn dialect and how they spoke and lots of stuff.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. I'm pretty familiar with kind of the Western dialect, and not necessarily Southern dialect, but the Western dialect, which Bill Judy more or less spoke that Western dialect. Samuel Moore's dialect, mostly I picked up from reading other books, movies, and stuff like that. That dialect is really difficult. The problem with dialect is that when you have 2 characters, each with a separate dialect, and as you're putting the story together, trying to keep their dialect straight, make sure you're not using one character's dialect in another person's particular story, you know. So that was hard. Of course, the Rock Creek, I have the Scottish dialect.
Yeah.
But that was a little easier because that was the only dialect in the whole book.
Yeah.
And easier. I looked that up mostly online. I picked up about, my editor said, Dialect is hard. People sometimes get bogged down in dialect when they're reading it. It's hard. They get frustrated with it because it's hard to kind of follow. And you said if you limit it to about 12 words and try to not do any more than about 12 words in that dialect, people will pick up on it really quickly, and that won't be so difficult for them. So that's kind of what I did. Hi, come on in.
Right here.
Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, well, you were calling it a trilogy, and I hadn't read any of the books, so now I know that this is a prequel. How about the middle one? Does it follow in line?
Yeah,
at all,
thank you. It's these books can be read independently without ruining the story for the other books. But the middle one, Crooked River, is my main character in Rock Creek. Her name is Myra, and she is on the cover.
Yep. Oh, no.
This is the first book I wrote, Rock Creek, and this is Myra. And you may already know that this is my daughter, Kim Porter. And she was just here a few minutes ago, but she couldn't stay for very long. And so anyway, that Rock Creek, what was it? What was I going on that thing?
Well, that's probably in the middle book.
Yeah, okay. So the next book is Crooked River. And my other daughter, Brooke, is right over there. And she's the cover of Crooked River.
One left early and one showed up late. Sorry, Dad.
But Myra, the character in Rock Creek, the sequel to Rock Creek is Crooked River, and she becomes an attorney in Crooked River, and she marries a local big shot here in Boise, who is also an attorney, and they participate in a trial that is very, very famous here in Idaho. If you're a longtime Idahoan, you've probably heard of the Steunenberg murder, the murder of Governor Steunenberg in 1905. And so she participates in the murder with as a defense attorney with Clarence Darrow. So they're defending Big Bill Haywood, who was Big Bill Haywood was accused of arranging the murder of Steunenberg. So Myra participates in that, and then later on in the story, she participates in the defense of a murder of her best friend's son was accused of a murder, and she participates in defense of her son. So it's more of a murder mystery, and there's a hellacious villain in this thing. I don't know, Jesse, if any of you read Crooked River, Mike Weatherall over there actually helped me with the legal parts of that, because I had to find some judge. And so I asked him to help me make sure I didn't make any screw ups on that. But yeah, it's a murder mystery. We have a very villainous woman named Jesse, and we have a guy that in that story, he's called the operative. And actually, there's some real evidence that the murder of Steunenberg was arranged by Haywood, and this guy was a paid killer, and he was from Montana. And so I've kind of borrowed from that a little bit. And so the murder of Steunenberg is this guy, this operative guy, and then he chases at the end of the story, he chases Jesse because he knows that she's guilty. So anyway, I don't want to tell you too much about that. Gary.
So I've enjoyed 2 of the 3 books so far. And a lot of how I feel about books is whether or not
Very readable.
Yeah. I may have asked, like you forget sometimes, I forget. The fascination and motivation for writing, how did that come about?
I used to write some in my job. I was in the executive corps with the State Farm Insurance. I wrote for my job quite a bit. I kind of enjoyed it. But then after I retired, I ended up writing a family history book that very well received by the family. I just wrote it for the family. And it was fun. I really enjoyed it. But this story, Rock Creek, had been in my head forever, since I was a kid. My dad showed me the area where an irrigation canal was supposed to be built. There was a tunnel that was going to be built from the South Fork of the Boise River and irrigate the whole desert, but it never happened. And he showed me, my dad showed me the remnants of the canals were built to scatter that water. And I thought, wow, you know, what if that had happened, or somehow it was a natural event or something like that. So that's how the story got started for Rock Creek. But no, writing is something that I really enjoy, and fortunately, I have a lot of help from Marcia. Sometimes it's more help than I want. But she's done some great editing. Actually, and Bill Judy kind of ran into a stumbling block. My editor that did Rock Creek, he was going to do Bill Judy, and he got sick with cancer. And so it took him about 4 or 5 months to get the manuscript back. And that was just last September till he got it back. And I could tell after going through his edits, his heart was in it. And so I wanted this thing to be out by the holidays. So Marcia and I sat down, and she really helped me. We put this thing together. And actually the ending, I don't know, some of you may not have read this, but the ending of this book was mostly Marcia's idea. I struggled with getting the ending right, and she came up with it. So it turned out pretty good. Mike.
Yeah, I would like to say that Dick and I have a very strange relationship because from the first grade through college together. But not only that, his father and my father went from the first grade through college together.
Oh, wow.
And the thing that I think you should tell people a little bit about your background in the sheep and cattle industry and your family's background, because the very first book you wrote is just fascinating because of all of the stuff you bring up that you knew yourself and your family knew from being in that business for 4 generations.
Well, yeah, my great-grandfather is from Cornwall, and he came from Cornwall with 2 of his brothers in 1868 to the United States. They were tin miners in Cornwall, and they States when the tin market went bust and there were no jobs, and they ended up mining coal in Western Pennsylvania. So there's a long story, Karen, about how they got from Western Pennsylvania out here. Karen's my second cousin over here, Karen. And there's a long story about that. I'm not sure how true it is, mostly legend. But they ended up coming to Idaho to mine, and they mined in Silver City. And he and his 2 brothers. And they were successful. They hit a vein of gold in the area around Fairview, which is close to Silver City, and they had a lease on the mine. When they thought the mine was played out, and they had the lease on this, and they found a vein of gold. And when the 5-year lease was up, of course, the leaseholder wouldn't renew the lease. So they had a little money, and my great granddad decided to go in the sheep business. He went to Jordan Valley to buy cattle and came back with sheep. So anyway, he down in the Hawaii area until the early 1880s. I'm thinking like 1878, something like that. And then they ended up moving the operation to what is now Mountain Home in 1884. And so he was one of the first pioneers in Mountain Home. Mountain Home was established when the Oregon Shortline Railroad came through. So it was moved from in the foothills up by Rattlesnake. It was called was called Mountain Home then, but it was moved down about maybe 7 or 8 miles down to where it is now to meet with the railroad. But anyway, so yeah, they were in the sheep business. My granddad, his son, he and his brother got in the sheep business themselves in the early 1900s. They had a feed store and several other businesses, and finally, they ran the business through good times and bad, through the depression and so forth. Hi, come on in. Right here.
Oh, that's okay.
Yes,
Yes, I recognize you. How are you?
good. You recognize my partner here?
I don't.
You should.
Should, I
Very.
classmate.
Um,
Must have made a lasting impression.
Yeah. I haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah. So, anyway, yeah, he came here and, he and his brothers, ran sheep. And then my dad, came back from World War II and he took over the operation. And we ran sheep until the early 1970s, I think 1971, and converted to cattle. And so I was pretty much involved in that with my brother. And we ended up selling the ranch in 1988 for a variety of reasons that would bore you to death. So anyway, so yeah, that's a little of the history. But Mike and I go way back. Our dads grew up together and both went to the University of Idaho and both bootlegged whiskey together.
Bob, yeah, so Bob Park from Mountain Home, we've known the Bennetts, the Weatheralls forever.
Yeah.
I think some of the best memories I had going out to the ranch, on Canyon Creek. Yeah, Canyon Creek Road. What was the name of the ranch?
Well, it's a Ditto Creek here.
Ditto Creek.
Ditto Creek, yeah.
Ditto Creek. Going out there, helping, always waiting for lunchtime. And they had, if there's a French Basque in the area, he was always French. Because most are from Biscaya, correct, in this area. But he was French Basque on the mark. And go there and you'd have maybe steak or lamb, and it was absolutely wonderful. And as Marcia reminded me not long ago, dried Lipton chicken noodle soup. So I bought some after you and I had that exchange, and my wife was like, "What the heck is going on?"
Yeah.
But our relationship with the Bennetts and many other sheep ranchers, cattle ranchers, farmers in the area really played a significant part in my life. And I can remember my dad was their accountant and shipping sheep, cattle. We'd go to the stockyards in Mountain Home, count cattle, count sheep, load them up, off they go. And then when it was shearing time, and I think you guys still have that building, don't you, along the tracks? The
Are you
warehouse.
talking about right there in the middle of town?
Yeah.
Oh, it's been torn down years ago.
Oh,
We used to
okay.
keep wool sacks.
Woolsack.
Yeah.
So growing up, my brother and I, and so they had these huge stands with planks off top, and people would walk up there dumping wool in. My brother and I and a few other young gentlemen would be at the bottom of the sack, stomping our way up to the top. And they had to be just right size to fit widthwise in the boxcar. So you're covered in who knows what. And then we go to the Stockman's for lunch. And all of a sudden, it kind of cleared the path. And so we were able to eat in silence. I thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, Frenchie was a legend.
Frenchie.
Yeah, I did a short biography of Frenchie and put it on Facebook here a couple of months ago.
Oh, you did?
I got more response from that than anything I've ever done.
Frenchie was amazing.
Yeah, he was a great guy.
I mean, you're out in this dusty place, and that was the cleanest kitchen, dining area. Well, to me,
Compared to him.
I was-
Compared to him.
And these mint green walls. Anyway,
That's funny because our friends Dave and Coco over here, years ago, we took them out to the ranch. And Frenchie was there, remember that? And he had, well, this was in 1976, okay, we were out there. So Frenchie used maybe one washcloth a year and then he threw that away. But anyway, I've laughed about this ever since. They call it the bicentennial washcloth.
apparently my eyes weren't good then.
I want to, Stephen, will you stand up a minute? Yeah. Stephen is the character right here in the book.
Okay.
The other one is my grandson.
Uh-huh.
But Stephen is my godson. And 2007 or something like 2008, when he was 7 years old.
Uh-huh.
And so we have been really close friends with Stephen and his family. I needed someone of that persuasion to be on the cover of the book. And Stephen Ball.
Autograph.
Yeah. I was starting to read that when I read that book. That was your grandson and your godson that you posed. It's a great, looks like an old picture.
Yeah, the only thing is in the story, Samuel is a little guy. So Stephen is not a little guy.
Stephen is good. He's short as
When we did the picture, we wanted Stephen to sit down and Max to stand up. Terry.
What connection do you guys have to Bennett Mountain? I've always wondered about that.
We take credit for it.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was wondering. But a lot of the towns that I think you talked about in the first book were kind of around that area. No?
Yeah, in the first book, Rock Creek, I really didn't want to, because it was local and I'm real familiar with that local area.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to deal with all the people that were going to try to cross me on it and tell me that, oh, that creek runs that way.
Oh, yeah.
This creek is over here
Uh-huh.
and so forth. So I used fake names.
Oh,
I
okay.
made up Rye Creek, Ryegrass is Mountain Home.
Yeah, okay.
Willow Creek is Indian Creek, and so forth. But Bennett Mountain is not really described as Bennett Mountain in the book.
Mhm.
But my great grandfather, who ran sheep I told you about, he used to run sheep up time, and I think it just ended up being named after him because he ran sheep up there. And part of the family owned ground up there too. We leased it from them. They had the north side of the mountain. And so we leased it and ran cattle on there.
Mhm.
But there's a place name book that's in the Idaho Library over by the penitentiary. What do they call it? Anyway, there's a place name book. I went there to look that thing up and make sure that I didn't get that wrong.
Mhm.
That Bennett Mountain isn't named for somebody else.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even mentioned. So
So,
we're taking credit for it.
Good for you.
Yeah.
I have a copy of the article you wrote about Bennett Mountain
Okay.
over on the other side. Someone was.
I wrote a story about my great granddad. It was in Idaho Magazine. I don't know if you guys ever are familiar with Idaho Magazine. That's a great magazine. It's has a lot. Each month they feature a different community in Idaho and write a little bit about the history and so forth. And so I wrote an article 4 or 5 years ago, something like that, about our great grandfather. Yeah.
So, any other questions? Because this doesn't have to end. But, I mean, there's food and drink in the other room. We have books. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
we need to
Dick.
sign some
This
books.
was
Yeah.